The first light of dawn stretched like pale fingers across the surface of Willow Lake, shrouding the water in a thin, shimmering mist. The gentle rustling of leaves in the early morning breeze mingled with the distant calls of waking birds. Everything seemed still, almost sacred, as if the world itself held its breath before the day began. Danielle Brooks laced her running shoes with deliberate calm, her fingers trembling slightly, not from cold, but anticipation. The familiar scent of pine and wet earth filled her lungs as she stepped onto the narrow dirt trail that circled the lake's edge. The path was her sanctuary, a place where the weight of the world, the judgments, the looks, the whispers, could not reach her. At 32, Danielle carried the grace and power of a former competitive swimmer, her muscles honed from years of training, yet her spirit bore the subtle scars of a life spent proving herself in a town that often saw her as other. Willow Creek was a picturesque small town, framed by rolling hills and dotted with quaint houses and fishing docks. But beneath its postcard-perfect surface lay undercurrents of quiet bias and uneasy acceptance. Every morning for the past 5 years, Danielle had risen before the sun, slipping out of her modest apartment and heading to the lake. She ran lap after lap around the water's edge. Sometimes people would see her, fishermen setting out their lines, elderly couples walking dogs, early joggers. Some nodded politely, others glanced away or exchanged whispers she couldn't quite catch but always felt. This morning was no different. As Danielle rounded the bend near the old wooden pier for her third lap, she caught sight of George Millstone, a regular fisherman in his 60s with weathered skin and a lifetime of stories etched into the creases of his face. George was well known in town, a quiet man who rarely spoke much but was respected for his years of patience on the lake. Danielle had seen him dozens of times, usually sitting on the edge of his boat, lines cast, eyes fixed on the water. She acknowledged him with a nod once, but he barely glanced back. Danielle didn't blame him. Their worlds rarely crossed beyond that silent recognition. The rhythm of her feet hitting the dirt and the steady beat of her breath created a calming cadence. Around the fourth lap, a chill brushed her skin, the mist thickening. She pulled her jacket tighter and glanced at the lake's glassy surface. The world was still, peaceful, or so it seemed. As she began her fifth lap, her mind drifted to the quiet judgments that had followed her through life. The times she'd been the only black face in a room, the casual dismissals, the unspoken distance. Yet, here, running alone before anyone else was awake, she found a rare freedom. Suddenly, a sharp splash shattered the silence. Danielle's heart jolted. Turning her head, she saw George struggling in the water, his arms thrashing wildly. His boat was tipped awkwardly to one side, tangled in a mess of fishing nets. Panic flashed in his eyes as he flailed, fighting to keep his head above the surface. For a moment, no one else on the shoreline reacted. Some fishermen remained in their boats, frozen by shock or uncertainty. Others simply looked away, unwilling to get involved. Danielle's breath caught. Despite every silent barrier and prejudice she'd encountered, without hesitation, she dove into the cold water. The shock of the chilly lake enveloped her, but her years of swimming training kicked in. She cut through the water with powerful strokes toward George, who was slipping under the surface again. Grabbing his arm firmly, she pulled him back up, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "I've got you. Hold on." Minutes felt like hours as she kept him afloat, paddling toward the shore. Once safe, George coughed violently, gasping for air, eyes wide with shock and gratitude. "Thank you, Danielle. You saved my life." As they sat on the damp grass, dripping and shivering, the first rays of sunlight broke fully over the horizon, casting a warm glow over Willow Lake. But the ripples from that moment would reach far beyond the water's edge, stirring a town to rethink what it thought it knew. Long before Willow Lake became her ritual, Danielle Brooks had learned how to breathe through the silence. She'd grown up in nearby Birmingham, Alabama, a city thick with both history and tension. Her parents had taught her how to move through the world, shoulders high, eyes forward, dignity intact. Her mother, a retired schoolteacher, always said, "Let them underestimate you. Just make sure they regret it." Her father, a postal worker and Vietnam veteran, taught her how to swim in a river behind their house, his arms guiding her through murky brown water with firm encouragement and unwavering love. Danielle had fallen in love with water early. It didn't care about skin color, background, or the way people whispered behind your back. It simply challenged you to be faster, stronger, calmer. She had become a competitive swimmer in high school, the only black girl on her team, and went on to break state records, earning a scholarship to college in Tennessee. But that world, too, carried shadows. Even with medals on her wall, Danielle was often mistaken for the assistant, the diversity recruit, or worse, completely invisible. The pool, once her sanctuary, became a stage for forced smiles and restrained applause. She learned to accept the loneliness that came with being exceptional and unseen. By the time she turned 30, she'd burned out. She moved to Willow Creek for a slower pace, for stillness. The lake became her new body of water, calm, quiet, faithful. But even here, the loneliness followed. The people of Willow Creek were polite. Smiling cashiers, nodding neighbors, the occasional compliment on her dedication. But beneath the surface lived an invisible barrier, a quiet kind of racism that wasn't shouted but whispered, that wasn't overt but ever present. She was never invited to neighborhood gatherings. No one asked about her life. She was the jogger or the swimmer lady. Always nice. Always distant. Still, Danielle kept running. Every morning, she tied her hair back into a tight bun, pulled on her hoodie, and ran her laps. She didn't run to be seen. She ran to be. The lake listened when no one else did. And every morning, she passed the same faces. There was old Mrs. Carter, walking her terrier and squinting at Danielle with pursed lips. There was Todd, the guy who always seemed to have something to prove, speeding past in his muscle car, music too loud, ice too cold. There was Benji and Marcus, high school boys who fished from the shore and occasionally laughed a little too loud when she jogged by. There were dozens more, people with coffee in hand, with fishing rods, with morning routines that brushed up against hers but never intertwined. And of course, there was George Millstone. He never said much. Just sat quietly in his boat with his flannel jacket and green baseball cap, line cast into the water, eyes like stone. Danielle often wondered what he thought when he saw her. She assumed he didn't think much of her at all. She'd overheard people talk about George, a man who'd lived in Willow Creek all his life, retired from a steel plant, never married. He had a reputation for being kind to kids, good with his hands, but old-fashioned. That word. She'd learned what it usually meant. He wasn't mean, just set in his ways. But that morning, everything shifted. After diving into the lake and saving his life, Danielle noticed the looks change, not just from George, but from the others too. The ones who had watched her run silently for years now followed her with their eyes a little longer. Not with suspicion. But with something else. Was it gratitude? Curiosity? Guilt? She wasn't sure. All she knew was that after pulling George to safety, he had looked at her, really looked, for the first time. Not with polite indifference or distant respect. But with awe. With shame. With something human and raw. "You saved me," he had said again, coughing into his sleeve. "You didn't even think twice, did you?" She hadn't. That was the thing. Despite years of being ignored, misread, and underestimated, she hadn't paused to weigh the cost. She'd just seen a life in danger and responded the only way she knew how, with instinct, compassion, and strength. Now, back at her apartment, wrapped in a towel and staring at the steam rising from her coffee mug, Danielle couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger had shifted. Not just between her and George. Between her and the town. Still, part of her didn't want to believe it. One act of heroism doesn't erase years of neglect. One thank you doesn't repair a broken foundation. And yet, the way George had looked at her, the tremble in his voice, the way one of the teenage boys at the lake had shouted, "Did you see what she just did? She's a beast." It stirred something inside her. Maybe people had finally seen her for who she really was. Not just the woman running laps around their lives. But someone who could change them. It was a Tuesday, crisp, breath-stealing air, the kind that wakes your skin before your thoughts catch up. Danielle had risen at 5:30 a.m. as usual, her movements rehearsed. Tie hair. Stretch hamstrings. Grab keys. Step into the cool morning. She didn't think much about the day ahead. She simply moved body, breath, forward. The lake looked like glass that morning, smooth and undisturbed. Only the occasional ripple from a leaping fish or the soft splash of a paddle broke the mirror. It was peaceful, deceptively so. By the fourth lap, Danielle had already passed the usual landmarks: the crooked bench with graffiti no one bothered to clean, the twisted oak tree whose branches clawed at the sky, and the old dock where retirees tossed their lines, their coolers half empty and their minds elsewhere. She didn't wear earbuds while running. She liked to hear her breath, the slap of her sneakers, the birds arguing in the trees. But that day, it saved her life and someone else's. As she turned past the eastern bend, nearing the small jetty that jutted into the deeper part of the lake, she heard it, something sharp, irregular, and wrong. A splash. Then a gasp. Then silence. Danielle froze. Her eyes darted to the dock. George Millstone's fishing boat, the small, faded green one with a patched-up motor, was drifting about 30 feet out. Empty. No one was sitting upright. No silhouette in the seat. No rod in his hand. Nothing but a tangled fishing line and a tackle box tipped over on the edge of the dock. And then she saw it, just for a second. A hand. Breaking the surface. Fingers outstretched. Then swallowed again. No, she whispered, adrenaline already igniting her veins. She dropped her jacket and sprinted toward the shore. Help, she yelled, her voice tearing through the morning calm. Someone's in the water. But no one answered. The lake was quiet. Too quiet. Danielle's body moved on instinct. Shoes off. Hoodie flung. Without hesitation, she dove, arms cutting the water like a blade, legs kicking with the power of every stroke she'd ever learned. The cold shocked her system, but she pushed through it. Visibility was terrible. Murky greens and browns spun around her, and time felt distorted, like the world had slowed into molasses. She dove deeper. Nothing. She kicked again. Then, movement. A flash of flannel. A shape sinking. She lunged forward and grabbed hold. It was him. George. Unconscious. Heavy. His cap floated just above him, a ghost of routine lost in the chaos. Danielle wrapped her arm around his chest in a practiced lifesaver hold, kicked furiously, and surfaced with a gasp, air and fear colliding in her lungs. She could barely hear over the roar in her ears, but then came the distant sound of shouting. Over here. Somebody call 911. It was Marcus, one of the teenagers she passed every morning. He was running down the shoreline, wide-eyed and breathless, phone already to his ear. Danielle didn't stop. She dragged George toward the dock with a power that came not just from strength, but from purpose, from pain, from resilience, from decades of swimming against the current. Her fingers found the edge of the dock. She hoisted him up as far as she could, and with Marcus's help, they rolled him onto the boards. Water gushed from his mouth. He coughed. Then choked. Then breathed. Is he okay? Marcus stammered. Danielle dropped to her knees beside George and began checking his pulse, then gently turned him on his side as more lake water spilled out of his lungs. George groaned, disoriented, but alive. She leaned over him, soaked and shaking. You're okay, Mr. Millstone. You're okay. I got you. He looked at her, dazed, like he didn't understand. But the truth settled in his eyes before he spoke a word. She had saved him. And he knew it. The paramedics arrived minutes later, along with a growing crowd: fishermen, dog walkers, joggers, morning commuters who'd stopped their cars to watch the scene unfold. George was loaded onto the stretcher, still clutching her hand. Don't let go, he rasped, his voice barely audible. I'm not going anywhere, she replied. Then she turned. And saw them. The crowd. Not staring in confusion or suspicion as they usually did, but with wide eyes. In awe. In shock. In something new. Recognition. Respect. Mrs. Carter, who had once clutched her purse tighter when Danielle jogged by, stepped forward. Her eyes glistened. God bless you, she whispered. A boy in a hoodie recorded the scene, mouthing, "That's her, she saved him." Todd, the guy with the muscle car, leaned against a fence, jaw clenched, as if realizing he'd misjudged everything. But Danielle didn't bask in it. She just stood there, dripping and exhausted, her body aching. Because deep down, she knew something had changed, not just in George, but in every single person who saw what she did that day. By the time Danielle got home from the lake, she was soaked to the bone, her muscles aching, her mind spinning. She peeled off her wet clothes, tossed them in the sink, and sat on the kitchen floor, back pressed against the cabinet, knees tucked to her chest. Her breath came slow and steady, not from fatigue, but from trying to process everything. She had saved a life. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. She saw George Weller's face every time she closed her eyes. The way his mouth had gasped for air. The fear in his eyes as the water swallowed him. The way his fingers clung to her shoulder like a lifeline when she reached him. Then, the relief. The gratitude. The silent thank you, and the way he held on, even when he was safe. Danielle had been swimming her whole life, but this time, it had meant something more. And then the world started calling. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, it was just a couple of messages, texts from coworkers at the clinic, then a voicemail from Tasha, her friend from high school who'd moved to Seattle years ago. But by noon, everything had changed. Her name was everywhere. Local swimmer rescues drowning man at Willowdale Lake. Danielle Barnes, 28, called a hero after saving longtime resident George Weller. Everyday hero, lake runner becomes lifesaver. One photo in particular was going viral on the local news sites and social media. It had been taken by a bystander, someone Danielle didn't even know. In the image, Danielle was crouched next to George, one hand resting on his shoulder as the paramedics worked on him. Her hair was dripping, her skin glistening in the morning light, and despite everything, her face was calm. Strong. Present. She hadn't posed for the photo. But somehow, it captured exactly what it needed to. That evening, Channel 7 News ran a special segment. Danielle didn't watch it live, but her neighbor, Mrs. Klein, banged on her door 20 minutes later holding her iPad. "You were on TV," she said, eyes bright behind her thick glasses. Look at you. Right there, they called you the Angel of the Lake." Danielle blinked at the screen. Her name, bold and bright. Her face, broadcasted into homes all over town. She sat down slowly on her porch steps as Mrs. Klein replayed the segment. A reporter stood near the lake, microphone in hand, retelling the story with dramatic music and crisp editing. Footage of the rescue played in the background, including an interview with one of the fishermen. "She didn't even hesitate," the man said. "She just dove right in like it was nothing. Saved that man's life before anyone else could even react." Danielle shook her head. "I didn't do it to be on TV," she whispered, mostly to herself. But fame, even accidental, doesn't wait for permission. The next morning, she walked into her favorite coffee shop, Bean and Branch, and the barista, Leo, who usually barely made eye contact, grinned from ear to ear. "Your coffee's on the house today," he said. "And tomorrow. And probably the rest of the week." Two women seated near the window clapped softly when she passed. A stranger stopped her on the sidewalk. "Thank you for what you did," he said. "It meant a lot. We needed something good this week." Even the mayor's office had called. Twice. By noon, the mayor, Thomas Callahan, posted a statement on his official Facebook page. "This week, Willowdale witnessed real courage. Danielle Barnes is not only an accomplished swimmer and dedicated member of our community, but a hero whose actions saved a life. We will be recognizing her bravery officially in next week's council session." Hundreds of comments poured in. Some were heartfelt. "Danielle, you're amazing. We see you now. Thank you for everything. Been running around that lake for years and didn't even know your name. Never again. You're unforgettable." But some were less kind. "Funny how people act like heroes just for doing the right thing. Would she have gotten this attention if the roles were reversed? All this for one save? What about our veterans and teachers? Danielle didn't respond to any of it. She wasn't sure what she felt. On one hand, there was warmth, real, genuine gratitude from people who were touched by what happened. But on the other, there was resentment too. Thinly veiled bitterness that she, a black woman who had long been invisible, was now the face of the town's heroism. Was the praise real? Or was it just a fleeting trend? A momentary distraction? That night, she sat on her couch with her journal in her lap, pen tapping against her leg. The words inside her felt tangled, messy. She finally wrote. They see me now. But it took someone almost dying. Why did it take that much? Why couldn't they see me before, when I ran past them every morning? When I smiled and they looked away? She closed the journal without finishing the thought. At 9:32 p.m., a knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find George Weller, standing with his wife beside him, holding a bouquet of sunflowers and a card. He looked healthier now. Pale, but upright. Eyes soft. I didn't want to wait for some official event, he said. I just wanted to say thank you. From me. From my family. Danielle stepped aside, letting them in. For an hour, they sat together in her living room. George recounted everything he remembered, how he had lost his balance, slipped on the rocks, and suddenly the world went dark. And then there was you, he said quietly. I felt your hand. And I thought I was imagining it. You weren't, Danielle smiled gently. No, he said. I wasn't. You saved me. And I don't just mean pulled me out saved. You gave me more time. I owe you that. When they finally left, George hugged her tightly. Your family now, his wife whispered. Whether you want to be or not. Danielle closed the door and leaned against it. Her eyes brimmed with quiet tears. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Not for the headlines. Not for the photo. Not even for the rescue. But for who she really was. The day of the city council ceremony came quicker than Danielle expected. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, trying to decide whether to wear the blue dress or the simple black one. Her fingers hovered over the zipper of each, unsure which version of herself the town wanted to see, the polished hero or just Danielle, the girl who ran around the lake each morning, earbuds in, sweat on her brow, invisible to most. Her phone buzzed again. Mayor Callahan's assistant. You'll be speaking right after the mayor's opening remarks. Just a few words, nothing major. There will be press, just a heads up. She sighed. Words. That's all anyone seemed to want from her now. She finally settled on the black dress. Simple. Elegant. Neutral. Let the story speak louder than the clothes. City Hall was packed. More than she expected. Dozens of chairs had been added outside under a canopy, or a giant screen showed a live feed from the main chamber. News vans were parked along the street, reporters already adjusting their lights and fixing their hair. It felt surreal, like she'd been dropped into someone else's life. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, applause, and polite anticipation. The walls were lined with framed photos of past mayors and community figures, all white, mostly male. Danielle spotted her mother in the front row, sitting tall in her floral print blazer, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her brother Darnell sat next to her, wearing the same old jacket he wore to every graduation and funeral. And behind them, George Weller, smiling wide, his wife holding his arm. The mayor took the podium. His voice was polished, political, full of practiced sincerity. Today, we honor bravery. We recognize someone who did not wait for recognition to act. Danielle Barnes saw a man in danger and risked her own life to save his. That kind of courage, he paused for effect, reminds us of who we can be, at our best. The audience clapped. Some stood. And Danielle's heart thumped so loud, she thought the microphone might pick it up. Then the mayor stepped back and nodded. Miss Barnes, would you join us? Danielle walked up slowly. The podium felt too tall. Her voice, too small. The lights were hot against her skin. But she gripped the edges of the stand and looked out over the crowd. I didn't think anyone would notice, she began softly. Not when I ran by every morning. Not when I swam laps alone in that lake. I wasn't doing it to be seen. I was just being me. The room was silent. Attentive. But when I saw Mr. Weller struggling, I didn't think, I just moved. Because if someone's drowning, you don't ask what color they are. You don't check their politics. You go. You act. She looked down briefly, her voice tightening. It's strange, being noticed now. Being called a hero. Because I didn't feel like one. I still don't. I felt scared. Cold. Unsure. A pause. But maybe being a hero is just doing the right thing when no one's looking. Even if your hands shake. Even if your voice trembles. She looked up. And if that's what this moment is about, reminding people to look out for one another, then I'm proud to be standing here. The crowd erupted in applause. Real applause. Not just polite clapping, but standing ovation kind. The kind that filled her ears and heart all at once. Her mother's face was wet with tears. Her brother raised a proud fist. George clapped the hardest of all. The mayor handed her a plaque. It read, "In recognition of bravery and community spirit, Danielle Barnes, the angel of Willowdale Lake." But not everyone was clapping. Outside City Hall, just past the news vans, a group of people stood holding signs. At first glance, it looked like a small protest. But then Danielle read the words. No more performative heroism. Stop the tokenization. Where was the press when real people needed help? A knot twisted in her stomach. She turned to one of the nearby reporters. What's this about? The reporter hesitated. Some folks think the city's using your story for optics. That they ignored racial issues in Willowdale for years, and now that a black woman saved a white man, they're trying to patch everything over with a feel-good story. Danielle stared. She didn't know whether to feel offended or seen. Because they weren't entirely wrong. For years, her community had felt unheard. She knew that. Her mother knew that. Her students at the clinic knew that. And yet now, suddenly, they wanted her on every poster. A woman from the crowd broke away and approached her. You were amazing, the woman said, a young black activist with short curly hair and bold eyes. Don't get me wrong. But don't let them use your story as an excuse to forget the others. The one still drowning. Danielle didn't say anything. But those words stuck. The one still drowning. That night, she sat alone on the dock at Willowdale Lake. The ceremony was over. The cameras had left. The applause had faded. But the lake was still here. Still quiet. Still cold and deep. She dipped her fingers into the water, watching the ripples spread. And for the first time, she asked herself, was saving George the easy part? Because maybe the real work wasn't pulling someone from water. Maybe it was helping others learn to swim. To see each other. To stop pretending the lake was calm when some were still struggling to breathe beneath the surface. 2 weeks had passed since the rescue, and everything felt different. Danielle still ran each morning around Willow Lake. The air was the same. The trees leaned the same way in the breeze. The fishermen still set up their rods before dawn. But now, when she passed by, they waved. They smiled. Some even stood and applauded softly as she jogged by. Her name had become part of the town's morning rhythm. But with recognition came pressure. She began hearing whispers that maybe she didn't deserve all the attention. That saving George Weller was just luck. That she was now the town darling because the cameras liked her face and the story was marketable. It stung. She had saved a life. But in some people's eyes, her skin color still made them question her worth. One afternoon, she sat on a bench by the water, watching ripples break across the surface. She remembered how cold it had been when she dove in. How heavy his body felt in her arms. How no one else had moved. Was that nothing? Just then, footsteps approached. George Weller. He sat beside her silently for a moment, then said, "Funny thing about ripples. They start small, but they go farther than you think." She looked at him. "You changed something, Danielle," he said. "In me. In this town. And not just because you saved my life. Because you reminded us what courage looks like and where it can come from." Her throat tightened. "I didn't do it to prove anything." "I know," he said. "And that's what made it powerful." The following week, Danielle stood on stage at Willowdale High School. She'd been invited to speak at their leadership summit. She wasn't a public speaker. She didn't wear a cape or have a fancy degree. But as she looked out at the young faces, black, white, Latino, Asian, she knew why she was there. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd be seen," she began. "I was taught to be quiet. To stay in my lane. To not make waves." A pause. Silence. "But one morning, when someone was drowning, I didn't think about who was watching. I just jumped." She looked out at the crowd. "You don't need to be a superhero. You just need to be human and brave in the moments that matter." They rose to their feet. Applause thundered. And in that moment, Danielle felt something stronger than fame. Stronger than approval. She felt peace. Not because the world had changed completely, but because maybe, just maybe, she had started a ripple. And ripples go farther than we ever imagine.